Hello and welcome to another episode of God-Sized Story. Today, my guest is Paul Alleman. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Paul.
Yeah, hi. I've been here at Village Church for well over 20 years, and I've had the privilege of being on staff for the last several years and leading our ministry to men. I've also been married for many years. We have 4 daughters and 5 grandchildren. We have just loved walking with Christ all these years and seeing how that works out in the lives of our children and our family. And so I'm happy to be here and have a chance to talk to you today.
Awesome. When I first sat down and made the list a while ago of the men and women that I wanted to sit down and record stories from, you were definitely at the top of the list there with me, because I've known you for many years now, since moving here to Lake County. You've been a very important man in my life. You've led me in many ways. I worked with you here at the church as your assistant, which was very inspirational to me. It helped change my life in a lot of ways. And through that time, I've heard so many of your great stories and so many great analogies from your life. And today you have a really good analogy that leads into a really spectacular story from your life. So I'll let you lead into that now.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for those kind words. And I just trust that the Lord, continues to use the things that He's put in my life. So, one of the things that I love to do is I've come to within the last about 12 years of my life was flying, to become a private pilot. And when I started learning to fly, there was no GPS in the planes, and there are still, even to this day, there are 2 instruments that we use to make sure we're heading in the right direction. And one of them is the wet compass. And that compass hasn't changed a whole lot, probably for 200 or 300 years in terms of how it functions. And yet we have one in every airplane. And the other thing is the heading indicator, which is driven off of the vacuum system. And here's the thing, we fly by the heading indicator, but it can drift at times. So we have to constantly go back and refer to the compass in order to make sure the heading indicator is pointed the right direction. I realized that, this is an analogy, I think, of how sometimes we are in our walk with Christ. It's like, how does God lead us in our walk with Christ? What does that look like? What does it feel like? Sometimes God gives us He gets us moving the right direction. He'll give us a vision or motivation and gets us moving the right direction. But then we need to be sensitive and realize that we will personally take over that idea and think this is where God wants me to go. But He wants us to go back to the compass and say, wait a minute. If we aren't listening to Him and checking back with the compass and readjusting the heading indicator, we're going to be off course. And I can tell you a feew times when I've been flying, especially in my early days, that I got way off course. And it was actually a little scary. Because I didn't know where I was all of a sudden. Oh, no. And so I have a good story, Craig, that I think that really was a huge impact on my life, because it happened many years ago. Just to give a little background, I had a desire as a young adult, to go to Trinity Seminary. And that was motivated by the fact that I grew up in a great Christian home, which I tell you is just, the blessing of that is hard to calculate. And my parents and our church, our little church there in the little town, was very pro-missionary. I grew up with every year and sometimes throughout the year, visiting missionaries would be in the area, and my mom always had them in our house. And I loved it because I heard stories about places in the world that I probably would never visit. And I heard what God was doing, and God used that to touch my heart and my life, I think, in a way that I never realized at the time. But so I had this desire all along to be a missionary at some point. And in the course of things, though, you grow up, you have to start making a living. I got married, I had a business, and unfortunately, our marriage failed, and that's a whole story by itself. But there was a point at which all of a sudden God gripped me with the desire that he had planted in me many years ago to say, then I had this desire to go be a missionary, combined with this idea that I'd love to go to Trinity Seminary. I started back. So I just fell on my knees one day before the Lord and I said, you know what, Lord, I'll do whatever you want to do. But I said, look at I've got a large amount of my family dependent on this business and there's a lot of people. I said, I can't just walk away today.
Absolutely.
But here's the thing. The Lord, over a period of 3 years, solved all those issues and made it possible for me to go. And it was a tough road because I had a lot of undergraduate work to finish and in some cases redo. But this strong desire, this vision of getting on the mission field. So my desire at this point was, hey, let's finish up whatever you need to do in school. Let's get to Trinity, get your degree, and get out on the mission field.
Fast as
that
possible.
As soon as possible, because that was the reason I was doing this, right?
Yeah.
And here's the thing, the reality started setting in. So I plowed through all finishing the undergrad, and that was a long road because I did poorly when I did go to the community college, the only college I had before I had my business. And I had to actually retake classes. So, I mean, just so that I could get better grades in them. So you can imagine that was, it took a tremendous amount of motivation. But,
oh, sure.
This vision, this idea was pushing me along. I get to Trinity, and the reality of graduate school really sets in. I mean, it was hard, and I'm not a great student. And it turned out that just a little foreshadowing, there were going to be other things that were going to happen that were going to really make a difference in my vision. And so about this time, interestingly, I had met a guy through a mutual friend, and he actually lived in the Quad Cities area around the Davenport, Moline area, just through a mutual friend. And it turned out he was headed for Trinity, and I was very interested because that was my heart too. And so I was thinking about so I was asking him all kinds of questions about what he's going to do and all that stuff. And so it just so happened that I happened to see him on the campus. I hadn't really had a whole lot of contact with him, didn't really know him very well. And we were at the bookstore or whatever, right? And so I said, well, how's it going? Because here I am, I'm still gung-ho.
Absolutely.
It's like the reality's starting to set in, and there were glitches and things. I thought I was done with undergrad, and it turned out that I wasn't because of a clerical error. And there were just a lot of things. So these things were starting to pile up, and I was starting to get under the stack at this point. But I still had this vision. I'm getting through. And so I meet this guy, and I wish I could remember his name, but God used him in such a powerful way that it literally changed my whole understanding of who God is and my walk with Christ. And I had walked with Christ, a lot, up to this point. So I said, how you doing? And he goes, well, here's the thing. There's no way I can afford to just go straight through. Sure. And he said, so I realized I'm just going to have to step back. Said I had to get a job so I could afford to, school, afford to live. And he said, here's what I realized. He said that God didn't call me to be a pastor. He called me to be here at Trinity for this time. And that just at that moment, if God had spoken to me audibly at that moment, I don't think it could have had any more impact.
Right.
Because the thing was almost like an electric shock going through my brain, because I realized what he was saying was God is just calling him to be faithful to what God has asked him to do. He didn't call him necessarily to be a pastor, just to be faithful in coming and getting prepared, right? At that moment. At that moment, it just opened up my mind to what God really wanted from me, which was not to be a missionary. That might be a step down for me.
Right.
What God really wanted was, first of all, he wanted me. He wanted my love. He wanted my devotion to him. He wanted my worship. And he wanted me to be faithful to whatever he called me to do. So at that moment, it was a process, but I started understanding that God isn't concerned about what we do. But a lot of times he'll give us a vision for that to get us moving, because there's no way I would have gotten to that point. And there's no way I would have gotten to and qualified for Trinity. I mean, it's insane. Even looking back at it, I go, how did I do it? I'm the worst student on the planet, right? How did I get to graduate school, right? But he's interested in who we are in him. And from then on, it took, obviously, this didn't happen overnight, but I started realizing I'm here for as long as God wants me to be here.
Yep.
And whatever I learn and whatever comes out of it, it's not my concern. It's God's concern. He'll make that clear to me at the proper time if I'm faithful.
Absolutely.
So if I go back to the compass and realize my heading indicator was pointed way off because I hadn't adjusted it for a while, it's like I dial it back in. And the thing is, following this as things turned out, because of the divorce in my background, I wasn't going to be acceptable to go to an evangelical mission at that time. This is mid-'80s into the early 90s, and it's like divorce was you're kind of second-class citizen in the kingdom around that time with a lot of evangelical organizations. And so, plus our kids had gotten remarried to the most wonderful person on the face of the earth. And so I hadn't even, and we have a blended family now. Mm-hmm. And so the whole idea of a divorced person marrying another divorced person was an anathema. The bottom line is that had I pinned all my hopes on what I intended to be in Christ, or what I intended to do for Christ, I should say, if I had pinned all my hopes on that, I would have been completely left drifting. Now, don't get me wrong; it was difficult to make that mental adjustment to say I did all this hard work and graduated from Trinity, and I'm not going to be going on the mission field. Certainly not in the way that I expected.
Sure.
But what I did learn was that every single day, as I'm faithful to Christ, as I'm faithful in that walk, as I come to Him and to His Word and understand what He wants for me today, what He wants right now as we're talking, what He wants as I go to the store, as I lead the men here at Village Church, that's the adjustment. That's really what He wants.
That's where the rubber meets the road.
And in a sense, for me to have gone on the mission field at that time would have been a step down. That would have been stupid, And I'm not saying, because I've had an opportunity to do short-term missions, and I've had the opportunity to do some of that. So I'm not saying there's anything wrong with being a missionary. I still think it's wonderful. But the bottom line is, it's not what God wanted for me ultimately. And it was a very hard lesson. It's a lesson I'm still learning.
Well, Paul, thank you so much. And it is such a beautiful reminder, because for even myself, of checking that compass, because 2019 was a little bit of a rougher year for me. And it was that same idea of like, I hadn't checked my compass in a while, and I definitely was a little off course. And even just, I know we've talked a little bit, is like being 1 degree off over time can put you pretty much even on a different planet. And that's just the tiniest little bit off. So listeners, I really encourage you today, examine your compass, have some good time of prayer with God and really find out, are you lined up where you should be, where you could be? Because the power that God has in you to just change your life and the lives around you is immense. It's unbelievable. And when we line up with what His plans are, God does just beautiful things through us. So Paul, thank you once again so much for joining us today. And listeners, thank you so much as always. We couldn't do this without you. Thank you. Goodbye.